Why ADX Florence in Colorado is worse than death row. There's a place in America where men don't wait to die. They exist in a state between living and death, locked inside concrete tombs designed to erase every trace of humanity. No sunlight, no human touch, no voices except their own. 23 hours a day, every day, for years. Some for decades. And the men sent there would tell you, if they could speak to anyone at all, but they'd rather face the execution chamber than spend another day in what the gods simply call the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Deep in the high desert of Fremont County, Colorado, about 90 miles south of Denver, stands the most secure prison ever constructed on American soil. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. Built in 1994, it was designed with one purpose: to house criminals considered too dangerous for any other prison in the federal system. Men who've killed guards. Men who've orchestrated murders from behind bars. Men who've escaped from maximum security facilities. Terrorists. Cartel leaders. Spies. But here's what most people don't understand. The worst punishment ADX Florence delivers has nothing to do with its inmates' crimes. It has everything to do with what happens to a human mind when you remove every single element that makes us human. The facility holds around 400 men at any given time. Each one is locked in a 7 by 12-foot cell made of poured concrete. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. The stool is concrete. There's a shower in the cell, but the water is controlled remotely and turns on only at designated times. There's a toilet, a sink, and a thin slit of a window that doesn't show the outside world, just an empty slice of sky that reveals nothing about where you are or what time of day it is. The door is solid steel with a small slot for food trays. When it closes with a sound inmates describe as final. Absolute. Like a coffin being sealed. But that was only the beginning. In most maximum security prisons across America, inmates still have something resembling social interaction. They see other prisoners during meals, in the yard, in common areas. They work jobs. They attend religious services. They have visits where they can sit across from family members, even if they are separated by glass. Death row inmates, despite awaiting execution, often spend years in conditions that allow for conversation with guards, brief exchanges with other condemned men, even occasional group recreation. ADX Florence was specifically engineered to eliminate all of that. The isolation doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. Every architectural decision, every security protocol, every rule in the facility's operational manual exists to ensure that inmates have minimal human contact. The federal government calls it a clean version of hell. Former Warden Robert Hood, who ran ADX for several years, later said publicly that the prison was designed to break human beings, and that it did exactly that. Consider what happens from the moment an inmate arrives. He is brought into a sally port, a reinforced entry chamber where one gate must close before another opens. Is stripped, searched, and photographed. Then is taken to his cell, where he'll spend his first days trying to understand the rules of a place that doesn't explain itself. There's no orientation, no handbook, just silence and concrete. The cell door locks automatically. A voice might come through a speaker telling him when to shower, when meals will arrive, when his 1 hour of recreation begins. But he won't see who's speaking. He won't have a conversation. He'll hear commands, and he'll follow them, or he'll face disciplinary action that makes his already unbearable existence even worse. What happened next, for thousands of men who've passed through these cells, was a slow psychological unraveling that experts would later compare to torture. The daily routine at ADX Florence follows a pattern so monotonous that inmates describe losing track of time within weeks. Wake-up happens when the lights come on, controlled remotely by staff. Breakfast arrives through the food slot around 5 in the morning. The tray slides in, the slot closes. Lunch at 11. Dinner at 5. The food is described by former inmates as barely edible, often cold by the time it reaches the cell. But complaining accomplishes nothing because there's no one to complain to. Between meals, there's nothing. No television. No radio. Reading materials are limited and must be approved. Inmates can purchase a small black and white television on commissary if they have money in their accounts, but it only receives religious and educational channels. No news, no entertainment, just carefully filtered content designed to prevent any connection to the outside world. Then there's recreation. 1 hour, alone, in a cage. The recreation pens at ADX Florence aren't yachts. They are concrete boxes slightly larger than the cells, some indoors, some outdoors with metal grating overhead to prevent escape or anything being thrown in. An inmate is escorted to this space in handcuffs and leg shackles. He's alone, always alone. He can pace. He can do push-ups. He can stay at the walls. Then the hour ends, and is escorted back to his cell. Some inmates refuse recreation. They say it's not worth the humiliation of the shackling process, the brief hope of something different, only to be returned to isolation. Others cling to that single hour because it's the only time they leave their cell, even if leaving means entering another, slightly larger box. And here's where the comparison to death row becomes important. Death row inmates in most states have regular contact with guards. They are checked on frequently. They have appeals processes that involve meetings with lawyers, family visits, media interviews in some cases. They are part of a system that, however slowly, is moving toward a conclusion. There's a timeline, uncertain as it may be, that gives structure to their existence. At ADX Florence, there is no timeline. There is no conclusion. There's only the present moment, repeating endlessly. But the routine was just the surface. What lay beneath was far more devastating. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who studied the effects of solitary confinement for decades, interviewed dozens of ADX Florence inmates. What he documented was a consistent pattern of psychological deterioration that he termed SHU syndrome, named after the special housing units where extreme isolation occurs. The symptoms are predictable: hallucinations, paranoia, hypersensitivity to stimuli, severe anxiety, intrusive thoughts, loss of impulse control, and eventually, a complete break with reality. Inmates at ADX describe hearing voices after weeks in isolation. They see shadows moving in their cells when nothing's there. Some talk to themselves for hours, creating imaginary companions because the human brain cannot sustain itself without social interaction. Others stop talking altogether, retreating so far inward that when they are finally transferred or released, they can barely speak. The silence is what breaks most men first. In a typical maximum security prison, there's noise. Inmates yell to each other. Guards walk the tiers. Doors clang. People argue. There's a chaotic symphony of human presence. It's unpleasant, often violent, but it's alive. At ADX, the soundproofing is so effective that inmates describe the silence as physical, like a weight pressing on their ears. The only sounds are their own breathing, their own heartbeat, the buzz of fluorescent lights. Some men scream just to hear something. They pound on doors until their hands bleed. They flush toilets repeatedly just to create noise. Guards respond by removing privileges, issuing disciplinary tickets, extending time in isolation. The punishment for struggling against isolation is more isolation. Thomas Silverstein, one of ADX Florence's most infamous inmates, spent more than 36 years in continuous solitary confinement, much of it at ADX. He killed a guard in 1983 and was immediately placed in isolation, where he remained until his death in 2018. In letters he wrote over the years, Silverstein described the experience as being buried alive. He said that death row would have been merciful compared to what he endured. At least on death row, he wrote, there's an end date. In ADX, the punishment is perpetual dying without the release of actual death. And what came next for inmates who couldn't adapt was even more harrowing. Within ADX Florence, there's a hierarchy of isolation. The general population, if it can be called that, consists of inmates in range 13, where conditions are exactly as described. 23 hours in cell, 1 hour of solitary recreation, no human contact. But for inmates who violate rules, there's someplace worse. The control unit. Officially called the Special Security Unit, it's a prison within a prison. Inmates sent their experience conditions that make standard ADX isolation look almost humane by comparison. Their cells are darker. Their recreation time is further restricted. Their access to even the limited privileges of regular ADX is revoked. Some spend years in the control unit for infractions as minor as refusing to follow an order or speaking disrespectfully to a guard through the door slot. The disciplinary system at ADX functions through a points-based structure. Good behavior can theoretically earn an inmate transfer to a less restrictive unit or eventually to another facility. But the requirements are almost impossible to meet. An inmate must go years without any infractions. In an environment designed to cause psychological stress and mental breakdowns, maintaining perfect behavior becomes nearly impossible. Former inmates describe the system as a trap. You arrive at ADX after committing serious violations at other prisons. You're already categorized as violent, uncontrollable, dangerous. Then you're placed in conditions scientifically proven to cause mental instability. When you inevitably crack under the pressure and violate a rule, you're punished with more isolation, which causes further psychological damage, which leads to more violations. It's a cycle engineered to be unbreakable. And the guards? They are trained to maintain distance. Unlike in typical prisons where relationships sometimes develop between staff and inmates, ADX guards are instructed to minimize communication. Every interaction is transactional. Every conversation is brief and procedural. The institution doesn't want guards seeing inmates as human beings because empathy would make the job impossible. But some guards couldn't maintain that distance, and what they witnessed stayed with them. Robert Hood, the warden who called ADX a clean version of hell, eventually left the Bureau of Prisons and became an outspoken critic of Supermax facilities. In interviews, he described watching men deteriorate mentally and feeling powerless to stop it. He talked about inmates smearing feces on walls, not as protest but as symptoms of psychotic breaks. He described men who would cut themselves just to feel something, just to see blood and confirm they still existed. Guards at ADX have reported finding inmates unconscious after suicide attempts. They've responded to cells where men have swallowed razors or hoarded medication for overdoses. The facility maintains a suicide watch protocol, but preventing suicide in an environment specifically designed to maximize suffering is a contradiction the system can't resolve. The most chilling aspect, according to Hood and others who've worked there, isn't the violence. ADX Florence experiences remarkably little physical violence compared to other federal prisons because there's no opportunity for it. Inmates never encounter each other. The most chilling aspect is the methodical erosion of sanity, the way human beings slowly cease to be human when every element of social existence is stripped away. But the architects of ADX Florence knew exactly what they were creating, and they built it anyway. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, it represented the culmination of decades of research into controlling the most violent offenders. The Bureau of Prisons studied previous Supermax facilities, examined riots and escapes, analyzed security failures. They designed ADX with one principle: total environmental control. If you control every aspect of an inmate's environment, you control the inmate. The cells were positioned so inmates couldn't see each other. The windows were angled to prevent views of anything meaningful. The ventilation systems were designed to prevent communication between cells through air ducts. Even the timing of activities was staggered so that if two inmates were somehow in adjacent recreation pens, they'd never be there simultaneously. This wasn't accidental cruelty. This was calculated, scientific dehumanization. Visitation at ADX Florence, when permitted, occurs through thick glass. No physical contact, ever. Inmates speak to family members via telephone while sitting in separate booths. Children grow up seeing their fathers through barriers. Spouses age without ever touching again. And for many inmates, visitation is prohibited entirely based on security classifications. The isolation extends beyond the individual to infect families. Parents make 12-hour drives to Colorado only to be denied entry because of minor paperwork issues. Children stop visiting because the trauma of seeing their father in that environment becomes unbearable. Marriages dissolve. Relationships fracture. The punishment radiates outward, touching everyone connected to the inmate. And for the men inside, the knowledge that their existence causes pain to the people they love becomes another form of torture. What happened to specific individuals at ADX reveals the true depth of the system's cruelty. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, has spent decades at ADX Florence. He's in his cell 23 hours a day, unable to communicate with other inmates, unable to practice his religion in congregation, unable to do anything except exist in the space between four concrete walls. His life sentence means he'll die there, eventually, after spending decades in a state of forced nothingness. Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, died at ADX in 2023 after more than 20 years in isolation. In the years before his death, he wrote extensively about the psychological effects of his confinement. He described losing the ability to think clearly, experiencing memory problems, and feeling his mind deteriorating in ways he couldn't articulate. A man who'd lived in the Montana wilderness, who'd valued solitude, who'd chosen isolation as a lifestyle, found the forced isolation of ADX to be unbearable. He wrote that being alone by choice and being alone by force were fundamentally different experiences, and that the latter destroyed something essential in the human psyche. El Chapo Guzman, the Mexican drug lord, was sent to ADX after his extradition and conviction. His lawyers have filed numerous appeals citing the conditions as cruel and unusual punishment. They've presented evidence of his psychological decline, his complaints of hearing loss from the constant silence, his reports of hallucinations and paranoia. The courts have consistently denied his appeals, ruling that his security threat justifies the conditions. But here's what the legal system struggles to address. How do you define torture? If you never physically harm an inmate, if you provide food and shelter and medical care, if you follow all procedural requirements, can the conditions still constitute torture? The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has explicitly stated that prolonged solitary confinement, defined as more than 15 consecutive days, constitutes torture under international law. ADX Florence inmates spend years, sometimes decades, in conditions that exceed this threshold by orders of magnitude. Yet American courts have repeatedly ruled that supermax confinement, including ADX, doesn't violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The reasoning is circular and damning. Courts argue that because inmates at ADX committed serious crimes or posed serious security threats, the harsh conditions are necessary. But the conditions themselves create the psychological instability that justifies continued harsh treatment. An inmate can't demonstrate he's no longer dangerous when the environment designed to contain him drives him to behaviors that prove he's still dangerous. It's a system that perpetuates its own necessity. And what emerged from legal challenges and investigations was a disturbing truth about American justice. Multiple lawsuits have been filed against ADX Florence over the years. Inmates have sued claiming violations of their constitutional rights. Mental health advocacy groups have intervened, presenting expert testimony about the psychological damage. Civil rights organizations have documented case after case of men who entered ADX with diagnosed mental illnesses and deteriorated into psychosis. In 2012, a federal lawsuit challenged the placement of mentally ill inmates at ADX, arguing that subjecting people with existing psychological conditions to extreme isolation violated their rights. The case presented evidence of schizophrenic inmates held in solitary, bipolar inmates denied adequate treatment, men with severe depression confined to cells where suicide was a constant risk. The Bureau of Prisons settled the lawsuit in 2016, agreeing to transfer some mentally ill inmates to facilities with proper psychiatric care. But the settlement didn't change the fundamental nature of ADX. It didn't address the fact that the conditions themselves create mental illness in previously healthy individuals. It simply moved the most obviously damaged people somewhere else while continuing to damage others. Dr. Gracian, the psychiatrist who studied supermax confinement, testified in these cases that the symptoms he observed at ADX were indistinguishable from those seen in prisoners of war subjected to isolation torture. He described inmates with no prior history of mental illness developing severe psychiatric symptoms within months. He documented cases of visual and auditory hallucinations, panic attacks so severe that inmates would hyperventilate until they lost consciousness, paranoid delusions that guards were poisoning their food or contaminating their air. One inmate told Gracian he could no longer remember his children's faces. Another described forgetting how to have a conversation, stumbling over words during the rare instances when he was required to speak. A third said he'd begun to fear open spaces, and that the thought of ever leaving his cell terrified him more than staying in it. These aren't fringe cases. These are documented, repeating patterns observed across hundreds of inmates. But the system had no mechanism for acknowledging what it was doing, and what came next would reveal why. The Bureau of Prisons operates under a philosophy called the responsibility model. The idea is that inmates are responsible for their own rehabilitation. They must choose to follow rules, choose to participate in programs, choose to demonstrate they've changed. ADX Florence applies this philosophy to an environment where choice has been almost entirely eliminated. An inmate can't choose to attend educational programs because there aren't any. He can't choose to work a job because work assignments don't exist. He can't choose to interact positively with other inmates because he never sees other inmates. His only choices are to obey commands delivered through speakers or face punishment. The step-down program, designed to gradually reintroduce inmates to less restrictive environments, requires years of perfect compliance. An inmate must go 6 months without any disciplinary infractions to move from the most restrictive level to a slightly less restrictive level. Then another 6 months. Then another. The full process can take 5 years or more, and any single violation resets the clock. In practice, this means that most inmates never leave ADX. They deteriorate psychologically to the point where they can't maintain the behavioral standards required for transfer. They become exactly what the system assumes they are: unmanageable, dangerous, mentally unstable. And the system uses this as justification to keep them there. Former inmates who've been released or transferred describe a phenomenon they call the fog. After years in isolation, they lose the ability to process information normally. Simple conversations become overwhelming. Making decisions, even trivial ones, creates paralyzing anxiety. They forget social cues, misread facial expressions, struggle with context and nuance. One man, released after 7 years at ADX, described going to a grocery store and having a complete breakdown in the cereal aisle. The number of choices, the presence of other people, the sounds and colors and movement, it was too much. He sat on the floor and couldn't move until someone called for help. Another, transferred to a lower security facility after 8 years, said he couldn't sleep without the sound of his cell door locking. The openness of a dormitory-style unit, the lack of concrete walls, felt dangerous. He requested to be moved back to segregation because it was the only environment his mind could process anymore. They'd been institutionalized beyond rehabilitation. They'd been broken so thoroughly that freedom itself became a threat. And this is where the comparison to death row reaches its most disturbing conclusion. Death row, for all its horrors, maintains a basic acknowledgement of humanity. Condemned prisoners receive counseling services. They have access to religious advisors. They can make phone calls to family members. In many states, they have contact visits during their final weeks. There are protocols for final meals, final statements, final moments with loved ones. The execution itself, regardless of method, happens relatively quickly. Minutes or hours, not years. And there's a societal recognition of what's occurring. Witnesses attend. Records are kept. The condemned person's name is remembered, their crime documented, their death marked as a significant event. At ADX Florence, there is no acknowledgement. Men disappear into concrete boxes and cease to matter. No one witnesses their suffering except the guards who deliver their meals. No one records their daily deterioration. When they die, whether from suicide, illness, or old age, it's noted in a file somewhere and forgotten. Their years of psychological torment are rendered invisible, bureaucratized into statistics that reveal nothing about the human cost. Thomas Silverstein, the inmate who spent 36 years in continuous solitary, died of heart complications. His death was reported briefly in the news, mentioned primarily because of his historical notoriety, not because anyone cared about what he'd endured. The fact that a human being spent more than 3 decades in a space the size of a parking spot, never touching another person, never feeling sunlight, never experiencing a moment of genuine freedom or connection, that fact was treated as an administrative detail. He wasn't executed. He was erased. And that erasure happened slowly, over decades, in a way that made his death irrelevant because he'd already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense years earlier. This is why some inmates beg for execution. This is why lawyers for ADX prisoners sometimes argue that death would be more humane than continued confinement. Because death row offers the one thing ADX Florence denies: an end. But the most disturbing revelation about ADX came not from inmates or lawyers or psychiatrists. It came from the people who designed it. In interviews years after ADX opened, some of the architects and planners involved in its creation expressed regret. They said they designed a facility to house the worst of the worst, but they hadn't fully considered what that facility would do to human beings over time. They'd focused on security and containment, treating inmates as problems to be solved rather than people to be managed. One architect said that if he could redesign ADX, he'd incorporate elements that maintained humanity while preserving security. Natural light, visual access to nature, opportunities for limited social interaction under controlled conditions. He said the current design went too far, sacrificing rehabilitation for punishment, creating a warehouse for human beings that would produce nothing but damaged people. But ADX continues to operate exactly as originally designed. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that it's necessary, that it houses individuals too dangerous for any other facility, that the security measures are justified by the threats these inmates pose. What this argument ignores is the circular logic at its core. Many of the men at ADX became dangerous because of how the prison system treated them before they arrived. They killed guards or rioted or escaped because they were already in violent, oppressive environments. Then they were sent to an even more violent and oppressive environment as punishment, where they became more damaged and dangerous, which justified keeping them there. The system creates the monsters it claims to contain. And for the broader society, ADX Florence serves another purpose. It's invisible, out of sight. The general public doesn't think about it. Politicians can claim they're tough on crime without having to explain what that toughness actually looks like in practice. The facility exists in a moral and legal gray zone where extreme suffering is inflicted in the name of security, and no one has to witness or acknowledge what's being done in their name. Every day, right now, hundreds of men are locked in those concrete cells. They are experiencing the psychological disintegration that experts have documented. They are losing their minds in slow motion. And the system will continue until something fundamental changes in how we think about punishment, rehabilitation, and what it means to be human. But for now, the story of ADX Florence continues, unchanged. There's a question that haunts everyone who studies ADX Florence deeply enough. It's a question without an easy answer. A question that challenges fundamental assumptions about justice and morality. If we accept that some crimes are so heinous that death is the appropriate punishment, and if we accept that some criminals are so dangerous that they must be completely isolated from society, then what are we actually saying when we choose to keep those people alive in conditions worse than death? Are we administering justice? Or are we satisfying a desire for revenge that we're too uncomfortable to acknowledge? Are we protecting society? Or are we creating a system that damages everyone it touches? Inmates, guards, families, and the moral fabric of a nation that claims to value human dignity. The men at ADX Florence committed terrible crimes. Some of them murdered innocent people. Some orchestrated violence on a massive scale. Some showed no remorse, no empathy, no indication they would ever be safe to release. This isn't a defense of their actions. This is a question about our response to those actions. We've decided that locking human beings in concrete boxes for decades, depriving them of every element that makes existence bearable, watching them deteriorate into psychosis, is an acceptable punishment. We've decided this quietly, bureaucratically, without the kind of public discourse that surrounds executions. We've built a machine designed to inflict maximum psychological suffering with minimum visibility, and we've convinced ourselves this is somehow more civilized than simply executing people. Thomas Silverstein spent 36 years in that machine. He went in at age 31 and died at age 67. Everything that happened to him in those 36 years occurred in boxes measuring no more than 12 feet by 7 feet. He aged without companionship. He suffered without witnesses. He died without the basic human comfort of another person's presence. Was justice served? Did society become safer because he experienced that level of suffering? Or did we simply create a monument to our capacity for cruelty, dress it in the language of security and necessity, and bury it in the Colorado desert where most people would never have to think about it? ADX Florence will continue to operate tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. More inmates will arrive. More will deteriorate. More will die. The concrete and steel won't change. The policies won't change. The suffering won't change. And most people will never know or care what's happening there. But now you know. You know about the cells and the silence and the systematic erasure of humanity. You know about the men who would choose execution over another day in isolation. You know about the psychological torture disguised as administrative procedure. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you accept that this is the price of security? Do you believe that some people deserve to suffer in ways that most of us can't even imagine? Do you think the system works, that it keeps dangerous people contained and society safe? Or do you wonder if we've created something that reveals more about our failures than theirs? If we've built a place where the punishment has become so extreme that it undermines any claim to justice or moral authority? There are 400 men locked in concrete cells in Colorado right now. Tonight, they'll lie on concrete beds in concrete rooms, listening to silence so complete it becomes a physical presence. Tomorrow they'll wake to the same silence, the same concrete, the same absolute isolation. And the day after that, and the day after that, some of them will go insane. Some already have. Some will die there. Eventually, after years or decades of existing in a state between living and death. And the machine will continue operating, efficient and invisible, inflicting a punishment worse than execution on people who might have deserved death but received something far more terrible: the slow, methodical destruction of everything that makes a human being human. ADX Florence stands in the Colorado desert, a concrete monument to a question we've answered through action but refused to acknowledge in words. What do we become when we decide that some people deserve to suffer more than death would make them suffer? The answer is inside those walls, and it's more disturbing than most of us want to admit. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real crime documentary. Thanks for watching.